So today, let's do a full video on everything that you need to know about testing. Okay, so step one, we need to know, why do we do tests? What is the testing for? So there's four things that we really do testing for. And the first main one is to assess athletic talent. So this is more in like a strength and conditioning setting where we're trying to figure out where an athlete sort of stands and whether or not they have the potential to, make it to the top 1% and to be an elite athlete. And this is more applicable to basically everyone. Testing is good to help track improvements. So if you're someone who has been going to the gym for a while and you don't necessarily record everything, testing can help you track over X amount of time. So it could be 12 weeks, could be a year, could be whatever time frame that you want. It can help you track and see if you're improving in the things that are important to you. And that's up to you. You can decide what you want to test on. But testing is a great way to track improvements beyond just what you're lifting in the gym every single day. So the next reason we test is to set goals. So using the test results is you can develop certain goals that you want to achieve in X amount of time. And again, this can be over like a 12-week period, year period, whatever it is. But doing these tests is going to help you set very achievable goals for that given time frame. And this is especially useful for strength and conditioning coaches who are trying to keep their athletes motivated. Because if you set a goal without having done the testing, then you might be setting a goal that's not necessarily achievable because you're kind of loosely giving them an idea because you don't actually know what they're currently capable of. So if they're capable of less than you thought they were capable of, then you're setting a goal that's way too high for them. And that's just going to be demotivating. They're not going to want to keep going. So you have to make sure you set goals that are achievable so that you keep an athlete motivated. And then lastly, a pretty big reason why we test as well is to compare to a population. So what I mean by this is we are testing so that we can see how we rank in terms of ability compared to our current competition. So the population could just be, it could be a global thing. It could be how you compare in a 1 rep max bench press compared to the best lifters in the world or everyone in the world. And where do you rank on average on the 1 rep max bench press? But it could also be a lot more specific. So if I'm a footballer, okay, I'm a male footballer, then I don't want to be comparing myself to all the female footballers. I don't want to be comparing myself to basketball players, to hockey players. I want to compare myself to a specific population that's relevant to me. So if I'm a right wing footballer, you could even niche it down more to right wing. So how do I compare to every right wing that is currently at my level? And this can also be age group as well. So you can compare yourself to people of your age. So 16-year-olds, 50-year-olds, whatever it is, you can compare yourself to that age as well. And this is just a great way to sort of assess whereabouts you stand and where you could maybe try and work on improving. So if, for example, as a right wing football player, I have some of the top speed of any right winger, okay? That's maybe something I don't necessarily have to work on. But what if my agility isn't as good? So then that helps highlight where, all right, my speed's amazing, but my agility isn't. So what I have to do is I have to test for it, see where I'm at, and then maybe try and improve on that over time and tailor our program specific to where we lie compared to the rest of the population that we're comparing ourselves to. So then the next part of testing comes under test selection. So the first thing we're going to talk about is metabolic energy system specificity. And basically what this means is that we have to decide, based upon our sport or whatever our particular goal is, what sort of metabolic activity are we producing during that event? So for example, obviously long distance runners, okay, they're going to be a more aerobic capacity, okay? So this could also kind of include footballers or rugby players that are maintaining slow speeds for prolonged periods of time, but they also have elements of sprinting. So not only do they have to test their aerobic capacity, but they may also have to test their anaerobic capacity or maybe their intermittent recovery, something like that, because that is what is specific to their sport. Now, on the flip side of that, you could look at someone like a basketball player. A basketball player is going to be a lot more anaerobic. So rather than testing their aerobic system, there's not necessarily as much relevancy to that sport. So what we need to do is we need to try and pick something that is specific to them. So like an anaerobic capacity test of some kind. The next consideration that we have is the direction. So in terms of direction, what this basically means is like, if I'm a sprinter, all I do is I run in a linear fashion. I just run straight. That's all I have to worry about doing. But in a lot of sports, there is a lot of change of direction. So just testing your, for example, as a basketball player, just testing your anaerobic capacity in straight line sprints is not going to be as effective compared to your sport if you were to make sure that you had a directional component in that test. Okay, so you have to then consider not just the energy system, but also the direction. So that again is in terms of like what sort of movements and rotations you have to do when you are playing your sport. So the next consideration is going to be the biomechanical element. So biomechanical movement pattern specificity. Now this, for example, let's take a basketball player again. So a basketball player, a very specific movement for them could be something like a vertical jump test, okay? When they go into their sport, this is very relevant to their sport because, you know, they have to jump up pretty damn high to try and like slam dunk or to try and block a shot, whatever it may be. But is a vertical jump as relevant to someone like a footballer? Maybe not, maybe not. Yes, there is an element of a vertical jump for when you're trying to jump for a header, so maybe there is a bit of specificity there. But if you were to compare how often you're jumping in a football game compared to a basketball game, there is a lot more relevancy to that compared to a basketball player. Okay, so you have to think of like the mechanics of your sport. So am I changing direction a lot? Am I using my upper body to push? So like let's take rugby, for example. So a front row, a prop is going to be in a scrum. So they're going to have to be doing a lot of pushing. They're going to have to do a test that shows what their strength is in that pushing motion. So for example, it could be like bench press and shoulder press, something like this. Whereas, is that as relevant for the winger? No, not really, because they're not involved in the scrums. They're out on the wing, where their more relevant tests might be something like, you know, your sprint speed tests or your change of direction test, because when they get the ball, they've got to suddenly change direction to try and dodge their opponents and get through for a try. So you have to consider the biomechanical aspects when you're selecting your tests to make sure that, it's as relevant to your sport as possible. And then this also, like I said, in terms of the rugby players, comes down to your specific position. So not only does your sport require certain things of you, but your position that you play in your sport requires certain things. Like I said, with that winger, a winger is going to have to do a lot more different tests to like a prop or a second row, someone like that, because even though they're playing the same sport, their roles are very different in that sport. So you again have to decide what is important for that specific player, not just based on their sport, but also their current position. So the next part of testing comes down to our testing sequence. Now, this basically just means if I'm going to be doing many tests in one day rather than spreading them out over a significant period of time, maybe a couple of weeks, then this is kind of the sequence that we need to do it in order for each test to have less of an impact in all of the other tests. So for example, the non-fatiguing tests like skin fold and weight measurements, anything that just doesn't really involve any fatiguing exercises, that's something you can do first. In truth, you can kind of do that whenever, but it's probably best to do it first, okay? But then next we have agility tests. So again, we're trying to do this in an order where it's less likely to impact the next test or the following test that we're going to be doing. So we're going to start with an agility test, because this isn't necessarily fatiguing. It's not going to impact us as much for the rest of the test compared to some of the other ones that we'll go on to. Because then after this, we're then going to go on to number 3, which is going to be max power / strength. And again, the reason that we do this first compared to the other tests is, yes, these are going to be starting to get like more fatiguing now compared to like your agility tests, but it's going to have less of an overall impact compared to something later on, like our fatiguing anaerobic capacity test. So doing a max power and strength test where we also need to have that high level of energy and neuromuscular, like we don't need any neuromuscular fatigue. We need to have the maximum power / strength. So it's important to make sure you're as well rested as possible. So doing an agility test and doing these non-fatiguing tests before this is going to be a-okay, because this isn't going to impact this, and neither will the non-fatiguing tests. So for max power and strength, we need to make sure that we have as much energy and as much drive as possible for when we do these tests, okay? Then next, we're going to go into our sprint tests. Again, there shouldn't be too much of an overlap between these two. Maybe if your maximum strength, or maybe if you're doing maximum strength rather than power, if you were to do maximum strength on, let's say, a squat or a deadlift, maybe there'd be some impact in your sprint test. But if you were to do something like a power test, there may not be as much impact. Again, it depends on how heavy you've gone and how far you're like trying to push it. But ideally, you do your max power and strength, you rest like as long as you can. Maybe it's like 15 minutes while you're testing everyone else. Do 15 minutes and then maybe you can go into your sprint test. But if you can, you kind of again want it so that it doesn't interfere. So if you can split this up over a few days, maybe the max power and strength test that I will do will be upper body focused if I'm going to be doing a sprint test. And then maybe a couple days later, I can do my max power and strength exercises that are lower body. Again, you're trying to manipulate the testing sequence in such a way that you can get the most out of every single test. So you're not, previous tests aren't impacting the results of the test that you're currently doing. So then after a sprint test, we're going to be going to local muscular endurance. Okay, so again, the local muscular endurance is going to be a little bit less fatiguing compared to your aerobic capacity or your fatiguing anaerobic capacity, because it's more about a specific muscle's ability rather than your overall aerobic capacity or the ability of your heart and whatever it is that impacts these two at the bottom. So local muscular endurance is going to have less of an impact compared to what we do in these two. So when we come into these two, it's important to start with our anaerobic capacity, because the recovery from a maximal anaerobic capacity is going to be a little bit faster compared to our aerobic capacity. Because when we do this, we need as much output as possible. Because it's anaerobic, it means we need as much energy as possible to go as fast as possible for whatever test it is. Okay, so we need to make sure again that we are as well rested as possible. Again, similar thing though to the local muscular endurance and the fatiguing anaerobic capacity is like, if I'm going to do a local muscular endurance test, and let's say it's, maybe I'm going to do a couple of them. Maybe it's going to be leg extensions to test my quad ability to go for a long period of time, or maybe it could be some calf, like as prolonged calf raises, for example, whatever it may be. If it's impacting this, so our anaerobic capacity test where we're going to be doing like sprinting and stuff, then maybe it's a good idea to try and do this on a different day to this. But again, if you're trying to do this all in one day, then just stick to this order. Because then lastly, we're going to go to aerobic capacity. And again, we leave this till last because it doesn't necessarily require a lot of like neuromuscular like energy. Like if you're a little bit more fatigued neuromuscularly because of these exercises, it's not going to impact your aerobic capacity as much. So you just need, let's say after your anaerobic capacity test, you just take 15, 20 minutes to like relax, get your like heart rate back down. Then you can go into your aerobic capacity test to finish. Again, if you can, ideally you split these up into like certain days. But if you're trying to do one day just dedicated to testing, then this is kind of the sequence that we would go in. And it's also time dependent, because if you only have 1 hour to do all of this, then chances are there's going to be some impact from test to test, but you should try and stick to an order like this. However, most of the time when we do testing, we actually block out like almost an entire day for it. So when you're working with athletes, you block out like almost an entire day. You'll start the day off with like your non-fatiguing test, then maybe you'll go to your agility test, and you'll go in this order. If you're just trying to get it all done in one day, that's how we would do it. But again, if you can, try and split it up as best as possible so that each test doesn't impact one another. And I get that that's hard if you're someone who's working and you can't dedicate an entire day just to testing. So maybe just 1 week, select the first like 3 of these. So you could do up to number 3, and then the next week you can do up to number 6 or 7, and sort of split it up like that, like week by week. And then after a 12-week period, you then go back to doing the first 3, and then after 12 weeks from your sprint test, you go back to doing those 4 at the bottom. So just, again, you can play around with how you split this up, but just make sure that you're trying to make each test not impact the next. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the test examples. So I'm going to go through each sort of category that I gave you earlier, and we're going to have a look at certain tests that you can do. Okay, now these aren't every single test that's out there. There are many more tests, but these are just some examples. And if you have a test that that sort of fits into these categories, then feel free to do that one. And also some of these tests you just might not be able to do because of the equipment that you have. Some of these require very specialist equipment. So you might not be able to do some of these tests, so you might have to find a better alternative. But let's go through them. So firstly, we have max strength tests. Now, most people can do these very easy. It's literally just your 1 rep maxes. So you choose what's relevant to you or what your goal is. That could be bench pressing, deadlifting, whatever it is. That is just your 1 rep max, okay? We all kind of know what that is. We all know how to do it. Then we're going to go to max power. Very similar, but this time now it's about trying to produce force fast. So for example, a 1 rep max power clean. So like some Olympic lifts, a power clean is one example. And then you got like your standing long jump, your vertical long jump. But then this is another one that you might not have heard of, and this is reactive strength index. So I've gone a little bit deeper into what this is. So the reactive strength index is kind of just your ability to produce force fast. And this is why it's called explosive power. So this is kind of like when we're like rebounding, when we're like bouncing off of the floor and rebounding. And this comes down to like our leg stiffness. And the best way in which I can kind of like help you understand is like, it's how quickly you can absorb, like transition from absorbing force to then producing force. So if I'm coming down from a jump, I'm like going for a block shot on a jump in basketball, and I have to jump up and then suddenly like sprint after the ball that I've blocked or something, then I jump up, and then it's how quickly I can transition from landing into the sprint to get after the ball or the player, whatever it is. So that is kind of what the reactive strength index is. And testing for that tends to require require a force plate. So testing for this can be quite hard, but there are other tests which don't necessarily require a force plate, but the force plate is definitely the best way to do it. Next, we have local muscular endurance. So these could be something like just your push-ups, as many push-ups as you can in a row, a YMCA and the YMCA bench press test. Now, with all of these exercises as well, just as an FYI, I'm not going to go through specifically how to perform each of these tests. I've shown a little bit of examples on my TikTok and Instagram and stuff. But if you need to know like specifically how to perform some of these tests, just Google them. There are like literally just Google YMCA bench press, and the first link that's up there will be relevant to you, and you can just click that and then follow along the guide. I don't want to make this video too long, so I'm not going to go into too much depth onto each specific test because there's a lot about each one. So this will be your local muscular endurance. Again, this can be something as well that you can do in your gym. It could be whatever's relevant to you. It could be like a leg extension. So you're setting the leg extension to maybe 50% of your 1 rep max, and you're going to see how many reps you can do that for. Maybe it's 20%. Again, this is just, it's got to be obviously quite a lot of reps, okay? Then we've got aerobic capacity. So this is like a 1.5 mile run, 12-minute run, and then maybe a yo-yo intermittent recovery test. So this test is probably a lot more relevant to those athletes that aren't just like running at a constant speed over and over. They're like changing speeds quite a lot. So for example, football players, rugby players, something like that. This is where that can be a lot more relevant. And then we're going into agility tests. So examples of these would be your T-test, your pro agility test, and your 505 agility test. And these tests especially could be good for people like basketball players, maybe wingers in a rugby winger, something like this, where obviously there's a lot of change of direction. And then lastly, very simple, is speed. This is literally just kind of like straight line sprints. Okay, so it could be a 40-yard dash, it could be a 100-meter dash, whatever it is, it's just kind of like straight line sprints, maximum speed. Maybe your session like assessing acceleration, so like comparing your 40-yard to your 100-meter. So maybe if your 40-yard is way off of like your average for your 100-meter, then maybe that shows you need to do a lot more on acceleration. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe your 40 yards really good, but your 100 meters really bad. So you have to kind of work on your top sprint speed. So these would be kind of the tests. And basically you kind of have to pick and choose what is, again, relevant to you or to your sport. Okay, so for example, let's take a basketball player. Okay, I'm going to take a basketball player and we'll do a rugby player. So what is relevant to a basketball player? The most relevant test would be something like max power. So for example, these three here: reactive strength, vertical jump, standing long jump. Agility for sure, T-test, pro agility test. Top speed, not really as necessary. Aerobic capacity, there's definitely like maybe a yo-yo intermittent recovery, but maybe not as important. Maybe an anaerobic capacity test would be better. But yeah, that would be for like a basketball player. Those are probably the most relevant for them. But then let's take a winger in rugby. Relevant for them, there would be max strength elements for sure, because obviously they still have to tackle. So some max strength elements like deadlift, bench press, definitely as well with power, because you need to, as soon as you catch that ball, you need to be powerful to like drive through someone or to try and be able to like get to that top speed. So this could be like your power cleans, for example. What else would be relevant to them? Definitely aerobic capacity, maybe again towards the yo-yo intermittent, definitely some agility, and definitely some straight line sprints, because once they're past those players and they're going for that try line, if they aren't fast enough, then they could get caught and they could get tackled. So these would be most relevant for them. So these are like a pretty comprehensive guide into like the examples that you can do. But if you need to, just Google the main category. So if you're trying to find max strength, just type in max strength tests, or maybe you're trying to find aerobic capacity, just type in aerobic capacity tests and find the one that is most relevant to you, or one that you can just actually perform, because some of these you might not be able to perform. So just find ones which you can perform based on the equipment that you have. Okay. So lastly, let's talk about Z scores. Now, as a strength and conditioning professional, it's very important that you know what a Z score is. So a Z score is basically just a number that you give to an athlete on each test that relates to how they compare to their population. So for example, if I'm working with an academy player, he's 16 years old and he's just performed a sprint test, okay? He has one of the highest sprint tests out of his age group of people that that play in his position or play for his sport. So he's going to have a very low Z score. So that means that maybe he doesn't have to work on his top speed, but then maybe his agility score is actually quite low compared to everyone else. So he's going to have a very high Z score. And so that means that as a strength and conditioning professional, we can figure out, all right, his sprint speed's good, his agility isn't so great. So what we have to do is we have to tailor his program specific to where his weaknesses are, so that eventually his weaknesses aren't weaknesses anymore, they're strengths, and that he can now perform better in his given sport. So when you do a test, there's plenty of research out there. So you can just type in, let's say I do a yo-yo intermittent recovery test. I could type in yo-yo intermittent recovery test average scores for footballers, something like this. And there are also age group specific, gender specific, but you can look at exactly how you compare to the average population that you're trying to compete with. So this is a great way, once we have tested each athlete, this is a great way to help tailor their program specific to their needs and where their maybe their shortcomings are, or maybe where they're already pretty damn good. So we don't really have to focus on that as much. And it's just about maintaining so that all the other things can sort of bump up to the same level. So if he's really fast, don't necessarily need to work on that. We just need to work on his agility, and eventually his agility will be at the same sort of level as his speed. And again, this kind of just helps also just assess whether or not a athlete has potential, because sometimes when we're assessing talent, for example, like combines are a way in which they assess if an athlete's any good. So 40-yard dash, if their 40-yard dash is quite slow, that is going to mean that their Z score is not so great, and so they have less of a chance of being selected. So it's a great way not only to compare to your current population, but also to figure out whether or not an athlete actually has the given potential to reach their goals. If they have really bad Z scores in every single test that they do, maybe that's a clear sign that they don't necessarily have the potential to get there. That's not necessarily always the case. Sometimes you can perform very poorly in tests, but still be amazing at your sport, because there is obviously a technical component to basically every sport out there. So if you have the technique, sometimes you can get away with having really low Z scores. But yeah, that's kind of like everything you need to know about Z scores. Okay, so there you go. That is basically everything you kind of need to know about testing, or as much as I can kind of give you in this time frame. There is definitely a lot more. There is ways in which we have to collect data, making sure that tests are reliable, valid, and so on and so forth. But I wanted to make sure that I kept it as concise as possible so that you can apply this to your own training or to whatever it is that you're doing, and you can help figure out where your strengths and weaknesses might be. And again, trying to set some goals that you could achieve based on the results that you get. Okay? So good luck when you try this out there, everyone.